Welcome to Recross the Paths. I'm Cade. My guest today is Mike. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
It's a treat to have you here. Mike, among other projects, is the curator of Ikoria at Home, and I'm so thrilled to dive into this cube today.
I appreciate it. I am always excited to talk about this cube.
As we jump in, I want to start by sharing some of the praise I've heard for this project. I got to judge at KubeCon for the last 2 years, and I remember hearing chatter floating around the hall of different people when they asked, "Hey, what's a cool thing you experienced this year?" I heard multiple times people come up and go, "Hey, Ikoria at Home was a hit that I did not expect," and you received lots of glowing praise there from from players at the event and then after the event, people describing your environment as something that allowed people to do the fun thing as the good thing, and I hope that's a huge encouragement to you.
Yeah, I entirely self-serving had sought out some feedback both during the event and afterwards in the Discord, and was pretty blown away by folks. So you're hopeful when you make something, and I think QCon is such a cool event. This is my first time getting to go and having something there, and just watching people draft it is it's very fun. You have that proud papa moment where you're like, oh yeah, look at the cool things they're doing, and then to have people just like anything you create, if somebody likes it or enjoyed their time doing it, then it's very satisfying.
Mike, give us just a sentence or two about what players should expect for the Ikoria at Home cube.
Players should expect a format that looks a lot like the original Ikoria set, but expands upon it in, I would say, logical but exciting ways. So if you want to draft anything that was in Ikoria, it's available to you. Humans, monsters, cycling, but they all have a little bit extra, a little bit more that really makes the format engaging.
I imagine you just came into the world as a fully fledged cube designer, but
Yeah.
maybe we should start a little ways back. How did you find your way into cube, and then how did that lead into a project like Ikoria at Home?
Yeah, so I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, but I grew up in Northeast Ohio and moved down for a job around 2010, and lived alone for a little bit, and had played a lot of Magic when I was in high school, and then picked it up again as a thing to go and do, and sort of got back into the competitive scene and found some people who had a weekly cube night and invited me out, and that was 2012, and those people are now some of my very best friends, and we have cubed off and on for weeks, and for a long time it was all their cubes, but all of us in the group slowly but surely, as we were like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I had tried some other small things. I'm a big battle box proponent. I love that format, and tried out some tuberts, which are also fun, but Ikoria was my first real go for it, and spent a lot of time with it and had a lot of great feedback. But I've got a decade of just weekly nights and just being surrounded by some really passionate people for the format.
So, coming from a background of battle boxes and tubers, so these small head-to-head formats, what inspired you to go for something bigger?
I think that once I had a good grounding for what I wanted it to feel like and what I enjoyed while I was cubing, that made me want to try it a little bit. I also think just the tools, Cube Cobra, which is where all the cubes are essentially hosted in conjunction with KubeCon, makes it so easy just to sort things and look at it and do hypotheticals with it. You don't have to make it in paper immediately to just have ideas. And I think that makes it really easy to just, you open a file and start adding cards and think about it. And it's fun to think about, just like anything like that, just to sit there and be in your head about it. So I think that's what made me turn the corner, and then good feedback from people just encouraging me to yeah, just do it. So as I said, I was a pretty competitive player. We did a lot of grinding, opens and pro tour stuff and things like that. And then a lot of us started to have families. Same was true for me. My daughter was born a week before Ohio went into lockdown for the pandemic.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, it was crazy, but we were home with her, which was nice.
Yeah.
And then Ikoria was the first set that released in the pandemic. And I played it a lot on Arena, and just found myself really liking this format. I don't always go back to Arena, but a couple of the few times I hit Mythic in Limited was playing Ikoria. I just really enjoyed that format. One of the cards in the cube that is sort of a meme. If you 3-0 in the Ikoria cube, you get to sign a honey mammoth, and that's because Honey Mammoth is like the card for me that's like I can play two, three, four copies of this card and it's always good. And if a format is good enough that I can play a 6/6 that gains 4 life, then the format must be wonderful. But we didn't get to play it in paper. Like that was the thing. I had never drafted in paper, sat down, opened 3 packs because just by the time we came out of the pandemic, we were many sets after it, and all of those pandemic sets had printing issues and everything else. So it was one of those things where I would tell my friends, like, man, like I really wanted to draft Ikoria, and a lot of them just hadn't. They hadn't played it, online format. They never touched the set. And so that was really the initial elevator pitch was like, hey, maybe you missed this. Like maybe you never got to draft this. I want you to have the chance to. Beyond that, who doesn't love a plane where humans fight gigantic monsters and who knows who's going to win?
The classic conflict.
Yeah, of course, yes, yes. Can many people take one gigantic horse, or right like that? Or a lot of mini horses once you break up the mutation. I think that's what the set was described as.
Yeah, so Ikoria, yeah, it was like a build your own monster, I think was their tagline or something like that.
Yeah.
So Ikoria is, and we'll certainly break this down as we go, but Ikoria is trying to do a lot of really big things. How did you try to capture that in a draft environment?
In my description of it, I tried to like focus on this idea of there's the big three archetypes, with humans and monsters and mutate, and then cycling as sort of the unifier. And I think that cycling is kind of the key to the whole cube and the format in general. Just as a quick aside, I love cycling, and one of the first FNM decks I played and like did well with was Astro Slide.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, right, like a classic. For those of you newer to the game, you'll know that as Astral Drift, but which is the to be fair, that is the one that is in the cube because Astral Slide does sometimes upsetting things when both players are cycling. And for those
Yes.
who played Flame Rift in the cube, that is there as well. But I think cycling is what sort of allows all of the decks to function, both mana base wise and like most of the decks that you draft in the format, you don't end up, I think, with that 22nd, 23rd iffy card that you're playing, right? Those are probably cycling cards that are somewhat effective, but also draw your other cards. So I think the decks feel fuller, even though there's probably less specific cards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and let's drill down there because I love this approach to designing from the macro archetypes and then these 10 two-color themes that trickles down into. So you mentioned your like humans, cycling, monsters as the big three. How do those apply then to individual color pairs?
Oh, so they originally designed the set mostly based off of keyword abilities, but those were even shared across different elements. The mentor cycle in the original Ikoria, where a human, one of the bonders gives a monster vigilance or lifelink, and then can power that up, sort of helped with that. And I think what was nice about that is that because each guild was represented and each guild had some sort of theme, it made finding those synergy points very interesting when you're going through, but also very like satisfying. So a couple of the cards I was excited about as I was doing that were like the chainer that is in the cube.
Yeah, Nightmare Adept.
That's the one. So it is a Rakdos card, but he has synergy with the bringing creatures back theme, which happens a lot in black in this format. Black green specifically has a lot of ways to bring creatures back in the graveyard, and also with the cycling aspect of it, you can discard a card to do this. A lot of the decks were already trying to do this, so he essentially has a cycling ability. He essentially has an ability that interacts with these other things, and he just fits right in. And I think in the original format, some of the guild colors, like in the original cube, were hard to play. You were often playing 3 colors, but I was able to push it out a little bit more so that you could play 2 color decks in this, and maybe you're only lightly splashing a third. So some of these cards are a little bit stronger. Similarly, in green white, there is the Ajani from War of the Spark.
Oh yeah, the Great-Hearted. Yeah, that
Yeah, the Great Hearted.
gives everything vigilance.
And just like there's so many, vigilance is already a sub theme in green white, but by giving all your creatures vigilance, all of a sudden that sub theme becomes the theme. So it turns on things like Fronlin Felidar or like Heel Bonder, Erler Heel Bonder, these things that. So it was kind of like finding those little cards that took something that was a fairly minor, right, like these little sub themes, and made them just a little bit stronger. Like, hey, you can make a deck here. Here is a payoff for this thing that I think makes those very interesting, and I think is what was rewarding for a lot of the decks, because when I was watching people draft it and testing it, it was fun to find like There are cards that are meant for a certain archetype, but the mana is so good, you see where it interacts otherwise,
Mm.
and seeing where some of those signals went. I think that's really what helped it. I want to say that that was like purposely planned, but some of those things are happy accidents as people draft decks, and you're like, I did not think of that, and those are fun to see.
Yeah, it's always nice when your players find more creative things than you intended, that they discover those for you.
Yeah, it was fun just watching, some people even at CubeCon draft, and I watched a deck playing Garuda as their companion. So Garuda is a good example of this. There are a number of clone effects built into the cube to help if you want to try and live the dream of the Garuda, flip a Garuda deck.
In Gyruda, you have to only have even cards in your deck.
Yes. So, which is a legitimate, restriction, but it allowed us to add things like Calidus Assassin, which is from the Warhammer set, which is a 6 CMC flash clone. So it plays into the flash sub theme of blue black, and it destroys the thing it clones. But essentially, I watched a person use that to loop them to mill their opponent out, and that's how they won.
Oh.
And I like loop that and the other, and I watched it happen, and I was like, because I think the opponent was like a cycling deck, so they had cycled through so much of their deck that was like, oh well, I'm going to make you mill 12, and that's how I win. And I was like, that was not a plan. That was not a consideration.
That's awesome.
So yeah,
I think a good note here also is that you have included the companions, for, for which Ikoria is famous, but you've chosen to include them with their original companion rule.
So I will say I didn't have a clear, like when I built this, some friends had asked that question, and one friend in particular was like, no, if we're going to do this, we need to play it the way it's supposed to be. And I was like, all right, let's do that. And I think that in general, it has been fine. The deck building constraints, even in a bigger limited format or a more powerful limited format, is still tough and limited. Some are better than others. Lutri does not get to be in the cube.
Yeah, something about a singleton format in this case makes that a freebie.
Yeah, it's super free and not tough. But I think that some of the decks that are trying to do, like Garuda, you really have to see it early in the draft, and you really have to prioritize your deck building. It is not free, even when the card itself is free, essentially. And I think that has sort of helped that a little bit. They're still powerful, but there's also an element of, I think, what was originally the goal with Ikoria, not to borrow from Pokemon a little bit, but like, some folks when they draft this want to catch them all, right? They want
Yeah,
like, okay,
yeah.
I want to go into this draft and I'm hoping to get this to do this, and I think that that has been really kind of fun to see. So, again, I think the format itself helps reduce the power a little bit, but I think they're just such fun. It's almost like little mini quests in the draft, right? Where you see one and you're like, okay, the game has changed. Now I'm doing this. And I think it's led to some cool things. Like I saw an Omori deck.
I was about to ask if Umori had actually made a splash at any point.
So Abzan Omori featuring Nethroi. Really good, interestingly enough, because you had things like Set a Wayfinder that's in here now. So you have some ways as just a creature deck to get things into the graveyard. And yeah, it was very cool to see. So I think people are really satisfied. And I think so far, just in my, I don't know about CubeCon, but in our personal play group, I think all of them have been done at this point. Even Loris, which I think is the hardest one to do in this cube, has been done. So I've been impressed by it, by people's like I'm going to make this work. I can't say they're all beautiful 3-0 great decks, but they're all fun.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, and I wonder if that's something you've noticed that you don't have the same volume of what you would think of as just a generic haymaker in your environment here. That a lot of the value comes from finding those puzzles to solve of, oh, look, when this goes with this, it makes something bigger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, no, I think that's part of the format. I think that's how mutate is supposed to feel. Is that like it is supposed to be this incremental thing? So it isn't just a giant creature that you want to do. Like instead, Auspicious Starrix is the card I think of that
Yeah.
it is a powerhouse. It is the card that you want to sort of have in those decks, as opposed to, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, Kogla is still here. King Kong's hanging out, but you're rewarded for that synergy. And I think what I really tried to do purposefully with the removal, for example, is like I didn't just want to add, like, it needed better removal because I was adding some better creatures. That was going to happen, but I didn't want it to just be like, okay, here's Path to Exile, right? Here's Swords of Plowshares. Here's, like, I wanted to make sure that the mix was right. So, for example, Capture Sphere, which is a 4 mana common flash enchantment, which was like in the original set, is still good and playable here, even in the increased power. Flash is obviously a keyword that matters, but in the case of some of the mutate creatures, it is better to keep them on the battlefield, but nullified, as opposed to separating them in the graveyard or putting them under an exile enchantment where they get to come back as multiple creatures. So I think like I was trying very hard to pay attention to those decisions so that it still felt like the format itself, but also like some of those things that are just like draft commons are still here, still playable, and doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, that is such an interesting puzzle to solve in a format with a wealth of mutate. Because yeah, if that mutated creature leaves the battlefield, it becomes all of its component parts again. So kind of refueling your opponent probably not where you want to be most of the time.
Yeah, and I think that's where like I made a little rule checklist card that I included in the box because as much as I love mutate, I will say I know that not everybody is adept on the rulings for it, and there are definitely some things in the cube like I mentioned Astral Drift that can lead to some interesting interactions again with mutate. So I think like that is one of those places where I think if people want to push harder in the cube, they probably could, but overall, I think like I going back to the concept of being battle cruiser, and I know that there's some comparisons to Ikoria to things like which Zendikar set am I thinking of? The second Zendikar set.
Oh, that would be World Wake. World Wake was the
Well,
second.
okay. But like had like that battle cruiser, like you're gonna play your 8-9 mana Eldrazi, right?
Kate in the editing booth with a quick correction. Hindsight would suggest that it's actually Rise of the Eldrazi to be the set with all of the, Eldrazi.
Here, I don't think you're necessarily doing that as much. Like some of those cards are here, and there's certainly games where like you cycle a Titanoth Rex and you bring it back. But in general, I think you have to do a lot of the decks have to do some work to do the best thing. But I also think that work is, as you mentioned, is kind of fun to do that thing too, because when it all comes together, it's very satisfying in this cube.
So something like synergy focused, a term like that can be a bit of a buzzword for designers, but it sounds like that's something that you've captured, at least based on player feedback here. How is that something you approach building toward as a designer?
Yeah, I think like the simplest way was to like look for those, you'd go and do a search for humans. But I think seeing what the set was trying to do and see where that goes. So humans were a an aggressive strategy, a go wide strategy, but also there was a hint at least of like aristocrats, right?
Yeah.
In the original set you have weaponize the monsters, right, which is a pretty good sacrifice outlet for damage. So then you start looking for, okay, where are those intersections? So like for example Zathrid Necromancer in black, which is again those who might remember Rotling Reanimator, but a human that when humans die makes zombies. It's one of those things that gave the humans deck a little bit of strength, but also played well with those pieces. And I think that's what you're just trying to look for. Like I don't want to say synergy is purely the goal, but I think you're trying to find those sort of happy intersections. And whatever you do, it starts to piece that together where cards can be playable in multiple decks, even though it's clear that like when you read Zathrid Necromancer, that's a human card doing human things. Yeah, but sometimes it also does sacrifice things, and that's interesting. So I think that's what I'm looking for. There are certainly going to be cards that are pure, I did add things like Champion of the Parish, for example. You need your signposts, I think. But in general, there's a lot of little pieces. And I think like I get excited. I'm going to focus on one card in general. One of my favorite cards in this cube is Goldhound.
Goldhound. Okay.
Goldhound. So when you're looking at creatures that can mutate, you're looking for keyword abilities. You want keyword soup so that as they mutate, they get better, right?
Oh, yeah.
So Goldhound has first strike, has menace, but also is secretly like this mana ramp. And mana ramp is very powerful in this format. There are not a lot of mana accelerators. You have a 2-drop in green that does that. You have a migrations path, but in general, it's not a thing that you do. And that can be like the difference sometimes. So like Goldhound is one of those cards where it's like, I need a red 1-drop that's doing something here. It also blocks fairly effectively. It is one of those surprising cards that whenever I see it in play, it's like, yes, Goldhound, you're good enough.
But that's so cool because Goldhound is the kind of card that this is not a vintage cube all star. This isn't the sort of thing you would see in other environments and go, wow, what a powerhouse. But it addresses so many things that you want here that if you've already acquired the mana sources you need, then yeah, this is a great thing to be sticking under bigger creatures. Or, like you said, you can just cash it in for the treasure side. Or if you're on the aggressive side, you have menace. Like that's really interesting how many axes that hits.
Well, and again, menace is one of the sub themes for Red and Black.
Yeah.
So like it also just has menace for that purpose. So it was just one of those things where as I found those, and another one like that, like Null Priest of Oblivion is in here, which is one of the kicker cards from the more recent Zendikar sets. And it's a vampire cleric. It has menace, it has lifelink, but it also has a kicker that if you pay it, it brings a creature from the graveyard back to the battlefield, right? So like it's a 2-drop, so it can block and exchange effectively with the aggressive decks. It has keyword soup, so it's good for mutating. But if you draw it late in the game, it does one of the things that the format's trying to do. So those are the kind of cards that I'm happy to find and enjoy finding places for, and I think like lead to some, if it's not synergy, at least cohesion.
Yeah. Or to borrow from Zach Barish in recent podcasts, that they're in conversation with each other.
Yeah, I like that intertextuality.
There you go. So, how do you work to balance humans and non-human creature counts in an environment like this? Because I'm sure that's a big part of making this make sense.
When yeah, I will say I try to keep with the ratios of the format itself. I think I limited myself to like, okay, I want to keep the colors and the numbers at least somewhat in line. So like if you look at this, like pretty much it's like 35 or 36 cards, in your base colors, and then I tried to keep all the guild colors the same, and I tried to keep the creature numbers similar. I will say the first few iterations, the first 2 drafts we did of this cube, the humans deck was absurd. It was it was so very very good because I think I was trying to give them some reach in some ways. You could find some either a lot of like party buff, you know what I mean, or more ways for sacrifice outlets, and it just felt like they could attack on too many axes, I should say. So we took that back a little bit, added a couple other like wrath spells, and I think started to find a pretty good balance, but it was tough at first. And I think, especially in a format that's complex like this, that has dirtily mana bases like this one can have, finding that balance for humans where it wasn't just going to run you over every time was a little bit tough. But I think we reached a good place with it.
And you mentioned mana curve being high. How did you approach mana for an environment like this?
What I wanted to do with it, and now I will say, the printing of the landscapes in Modern Horizons 3 actually solved like a large problem for this cube, so that was incredibly helpful.
I will note that between surveil lands and landscapes, this last year has just been a gold mine for cube designers.
I can't believe how good like surveillance just feel. I know that's off topic, but like in playing with them, they feel so good.
Well, yeah, well, and in the same way, those I've seen landscapes in more and more environments these days, and it sounds like it certainly hits here as you're trying to touch so many different colors.
Yeah, I mean they're already in the wedges that I'm in. They have cycling, but they also come into play untapped, which I think is one of those things you're trying to balance. Like inherently, the larger, especially 3-color decks, are going to have slower mana bases, more robust mana bases, and I tried to do that by having both the thriving cycle here and the vivid cycle. There's a lot of options, and the gates, I should say. So there's a lot of options and choice for players. So I'm not trying to hamstring, but it's not like fetch shock. Things aren't coming to play untapped. There's a cycle of pain lands, but they're the enemy pain lands, and those are in general to help empower the more aggressive strategies a little bit, so they're not as hampered in that way. But initially, I had all of the triomes and then all of the wedges from essentially when they printed the other triomes. And I thought about including those because I really like the idea of land cycling working with the triomes and the dual lands that have types. The Lord of the Rings land cyclers are really, really good here
Oh yeah.
because they can essentially act as like tapped lands when you're building your mana bases. But when we had all 10 of the triome cards in here, mana was way too good.
Mm.
I had some people like reach out about how maybe they felt that Karuga was not playable, like it was not good enough in here. I was like, oh, if you'd only seen the first run of this, where it was 5-color every time, that was that was the deck. Like that's what you were trying to do. Like the Karuga was like the deck, and you played 5 colors, and so the landscapes helped make that a little bit easier. Again, I want players to be able to play the deck they want to play, and the thriving lands, the manor, the gates, I should say, like like Manor Gate or Black Dragon Gate, give people a lot of freedom and control over their mana bases, which I think makes the decks feel better. You get to cast your spells, but there's still some tension in the what are you going to choose for this? How are you going to sequence? So I think for the player that just wants to draft and cast their spells, they can do that, and You can generally do it on curve. You can draft those land cyclers, and cycling in general helps thin your deck to get to those things. But if you're also careful about it, you can sequence it in a way that feels very, very satisfying.
Well, and it doesn't seem that the format is so blisteringly fast that you're terribly punished for playing a gate here. They're one of the top thriving lands or something like that.
No, there are certainly draws. A white, as I mentioned, he does have you champion the parish, and there are flourishing fox remains terrifying.
Yeah, you can't fix that one.
I think one of the, and this is just a cube thing in general, and like maybe for myself as someone before I really designed anything, did not appreciate enough, but like those are scary, but they are not common. You can't have multiple flourishing foxes, right? And I think those decks in the original format you could. Those the recycling decks had a couple of foxes, or they had multiple copies of Zenith Flare, which made.
Yeah, Zenith Flare was coming to mind.
But here you only have one in the cube, and people hate it. Like people will hate that card when they're drafting, and so I think like you can't count on. I think you can't count on those things necessarily coming to you. So the cycling deck has to think on its feet and draft Astral Drift or draft Drake Haven, which is another personal card. These are pet cards. I love cycling very much. I don't know. I think like that's what helps with this a little bit too, is that you can't just expect that something's going to happen, or you don't luck into having multiple copies of these things. So between piecing together the mana base and everything else, I think the decks end up in a good place, and the aggro draws are not consistent enough to always run you over. Sometimes they will, and that's going to happen, and sometimes we all deserve that.
I would say I'm hopeful that Wizards of the Coast may someday complete the cycling tap lands cycle.
I really hope so. I really hope so. I know that a friend of mine has them in a cube that somebody created and generically named them so they could have them. Like, no, this exists,
It exists
and
in our hearts.
it exists in our hearts, and someday maybe in our hands.
So with a cube like this that is based on a set like Ikoria, do you think of this environment as like kind of a museum of sorts, or do you think of it as something more dynamic?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I want to say it's in the middle. It's certainly I don't think a pure museum. Like it's not going to get drastic changes. I mean, I guess until we get Ikoria 2, the search for more money. But
Ikoria the T-shirt, Ikoria
yeah,
the lunchbox.
Ikoria the flamethrower. The kids love that one. But I think like what's cool about this is that there's a bunch of commander cards in here that are from Ikoria. There were Ikoria commander decks and characters. I think that was something that was kind of cool. I know that if folks use Scryfall at all, they have a flavor search. So you can search
Yeah.
for like I can search for Ikoria and see if there are printings of cards or things that have those. So I think like whenever they add something like that, I think that's interesting. I think the supreme verdict that I have in here that is Ikoria theme, those kind of changes are good. But I also think that I try to find like every set that comes out, I'll at least take a look at, and when you find a card that fits, I think I'm going to try to make that work. I think about things like everyone's favorite Mega Man X villain, Armored Armadillo, is in the cube. But when you look at it, like it's a 1 mana 0/4, right? It's an armadillo, so it can mutate. It has Ward 1, which is a relevant keyword ability, and it has a mana sink. So it blocks early on and it mutates and becomes a threat later. It's one of those things where it's just a common, but it really fits what the cube is trying to do. So I think whenever I could find something like that, or the landscapes, I'm not precious about it. I will add them, I will try them. This isn't a Vorthos cube by any stretch, but I do like the flavor. Something like Toby Beastie Befriender.
Yeah. That seems like such a cool inclusion here.
I mean, he's a bonder, right?
I mean, yeah, in all but name.
But by definition, and I think so. I think that's kind of cool, but also like because it makes a token, it secretly works well with like Astral Drift. So I think like it's one of those things where it's thematically relevant. It plays well with stuff in the format. So when I find cards like that, I'm not gonna say nope, we're done. We're not doing that. I'm going to look for those pieces, or things like I will say one of the small things about Ikoria that's cool, and I did not mention, but like something from I think the last Modern Horizon set was Gift to the Viper, the green instant. It puts a +1/+1 counter, a reach counter, and a death touch counter on target creature and untaps it.
Oh yeah, quite the combat trick.
Oh yeah, in Ikoria they had sudden spinnerets, It gave it +1/+3, untapped it, and gave it a reach counter. And it's just one of those things where these are very, very similar, but this is just a little bit better and plays more with those ability counters. And I think anytime they dip back into the ability counter space, which started here, which started in Ikoria, I'm also going to look for those things as well. So if it's thematic, if I think it fits, I'm going to stick with it. I don't want it to necessarily be a museum. But like I said, if they do inevitably revisit this plane, I may have to revisit that sentiment.
The museum is reopened.
Yeah, right.
So thinking about this project holistically, what are the core elements you think that make this feel like Ikoria to you?
Well, definitely Honey Mammoth.
Yeah, yeah.
I say that sort of jokingly, but like it was a thing where like I would draft a lot of the like Soul Tide decks when I was playing it, and I would measure success by if you can play that card and the format supports it. But I think there's some play patterns that feel very I want to say feel Ikoria, like cycling Greater Sandworm and then bringing it back later with something like Unbreakable Bond, right? Like that was like just a common play pattern that's still here, that's still good here, and just like feels like that format. I think if you're doing the cycling thing and you do hit that huge zenith, right? Like that feels very good and feels very Ikoria. So I think that there's a lot of things here that if you did draft that original format, there's enough here that you're expecting to see and that feels good that's going to do that. And I think there's just natural places to expand from that. I think that one of the things I got some feedback for, people were really excited to see the Jurassic Park cards here. And so was I. I was excited to put them in here, Dino DNA.
Yeah, another story of big monsters here.
100%. But I think like it fits so well that you're just like, I think there are times, and even going to CubeCon, and I'm not going to name specifics, but to offer some sort of like criticism, because who am I? But like there were some formats that like very much were like, hey, I'm trying to do this thing. There's one in particular that was like, hey, I'm trying to fit this theme of standard from this time period, and it had a bunch of like commons in it that were like, yeah, I like all this stuff. And then like the match I played, my opponent had two swords, swords of blank and blank attached to a creature, and I was like, I didn't see any of those, and I don't have anything that interacts with those. And I feel like this format doesn't necessarily, those gaps are going to happen sometimes when you're playing those formats, right? Like cards like that are such outliers. And I don't feel like this has that outlier, at least not anymore. We fixed humans. I promise we fixed it. And I think that makes it feel just a little bit better. Like I said, I think anything you draft in here could win a pod. And I think that's the thing that makes it feel like, you say it feels like the set. I think that's what I felt like when I drafted it. It was like, if you can have fun, like you said, have the fun, but also have the fun be the good thing. And that is what's made me most happy about it.
That's such a beautiful thing to think that anything is viable, and that's the sort of thing that we say often as designers, but to actually get something close to that where it feels like players can dig their teeth into something and feel like it's not a trap is pretty profound.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to I don't want to sit here and act like this is like the perfect draft format. And I'm sure there are people that walked away from it going, I'm frustrated about this or that. But I think that I guess like for myself, it's just like wherever, like I said, I could find those synergy points or find those things that just like looking through some of the things I had thought about in doing this stuff, like adding Crackling Drake to the Izzet colors, because one of the things that the original Ikoria was careful about was like not having a lot of graveyard hate, because they did have Zenith Flare as like this win condition. Well, here
Yeah.
I want people to have something they can sideboard, something they can do. So then, how can the cycling deck draft to counter that back? And something like Crackling Drake is a really elegant way to like be like that, and Beacon Bolt that goes with it, where they now check your exile as well as your graveyard for your spells. So again, it's like, okay, play the graveyard hate. Zenith is turned off, but now I have an answer around this. So I feel like that is where I try to find some points where you can do the thing you want to do, you can counter the thing, but you can counter it back. Like your deck isn't just turned off. Like, oh, cycling's bad. Like that's not going to happen. And like the humans have enough robustness that if they do get wrathed, if you play Supreme Verdict, the game's not over. And I think that is where those pieces I tried very hard to find some way out of it if possible.
Well, yeah, and I think there's a value in that humility that you've expressed too. That it's not like it's all solved. We haven't
No.
addressed every issue, but it's nice to think that the progress has been positive. And I think the core part of that you've described is taking the time to play test actively, to work through it again and again.
You mean the Ikoria part of it? That was a bad core pun.
Oh. Here, see, I'm here for the puns and I'm missing them. Oh man. Um, But it sounds like there's such a value in having a group to play test with and getting to show this to your friends and share it with them and get feedback and then act on it.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that we got tons and tons of drafts in with it, but they were super helpful in doing that and a lot of theory crafting and discussions and yeah, just having people to bounce off of and people who have done it, people who have. I think that's one of the great things about just the Discord in general for for KubeCon is that you have people who are willing to share feedback, who have built cubes, who have done it. That's why I went looking for feedback after we were done because it's just like, hey, like you all have done this more than I have. Tell me what tell me what I can do, and I think that was super helpful. And I did get some like specific like pointed feedback. So yeah, just having people to bounce it off of, having people to test it, and like I think also just being able to know that like okay, yeah, sometimes that's bad. Sometimes the card does not does not work. Sometimes the sometimes the interaction does not function the way you want it to, and being okay with that.
Some things are just good ideas and less so in practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the spirit of feedback, what kind of advice would you offer to other designers as they're considering their own projects?
I also want to ride a fence here, but be humble and look for feedback. I think that sometimes we can be stubborn, especially when like I have definitely built things, decks, whatever else, based off of an idea in my head, and you can get married to it. And sometimes having an open mind, it can really grow into something else and become better. But on the flip side of that, I also think that sometimes the reasons that we make something, I made this because I loved that draft set and I wanted to have a chance to draft it again. And that was selfish. That's for me. I wanted that. And I'm glad that other people enjoy that. But I also think that sometimes people will try to talk you out of that sometimes. Like, well, you could do this. Well, I don't want to do this. I want to draft big, Godzilla monsters. And watch them smash into each other. That's what I want to do. And I think that's where you should be open-minded, but also like be an advocate for your own wants. Like if you're making something, do it for yourself.
That's excellent.
The biggest thing for myself is that I wanted to make sure that things are available and playable and the sub themes are all there. I think one of the things that I like a lot is that like I think if you set out to build a format that has ultimatums in it, like Ikoria has a cycle of ultimatums. I think Wizards of the Coast, like WotC does a good job with this. If you put them in a format, they have to be an aspiration, right? You have to actually be able to cast them. And I
Yes.
think like that is a thing where I tried to remember that going into this is that like, okay, these are in here. They can't just be in here because they were in the set. You need to be able to cast them in the format and then be impactful. And I think I have seen all of them cast very effectively. And it is not some like, oh, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to cast this. I've already lost before this, or the mana doesn't do it. Like, no, they're there. They are legitimate. And I think like that is, maybe one way to view the format. Like if you're going to put ultimatums in your format, they need to be achievable.
Yeah, to borrow a phrase from a friend of mine, you don't want them to be art cards, like just a fancy thing to look at in the cube. You want it to be something you can actually play.
It was the Wolverine meme, just like a framed
Okay.
ultimatum that you're just like, ah.
Someday I will ruin my opponent with my favorite three creatures.
I have a good friend of ours who we draft with, who we mess with all the time because he drafts 1-drop 7-drop decks. But this is a 1-drop 7-drop format, so I can't I can't really.
You've given your friend the tools. They're all right
Yes,
there.
yeah, it's all there. It's all for him.
Well, Mike, as we trend toward wrapping up here, I want to ask you one of my favorite questions, which is if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would you pick and who would you want to do the illustration?
So I have to say I love this question, and I really thought about it, and I thought so hard about it that I have two answers, and I apologize. So.
Totally fair. Nobody pays attention to the rules anymore anyway.
So I think the obvious one, I've said it enough times, it would have to be a honey mammoth, and I think I would want Elena Danner to illustrate it. With just this,
Absolutely. Great choice.
her landscapes are just like I have a number of cards signed by her, and just like she's great. And I think that like just seeing my sticky elephant friend in just a beautiful landscape would make me so happy, and that people could sign it.
I love that.
But I guess more on brand for myself, I would probably be a young pyromancer is the other option I would give, and I would have that illustrated by Mark Poole. So I have when I was playing constructed and playing a lot, played a lot of red decks, a lot of Boros decks. And years ago, like the second or third ever Gen Con I attended when I was still in high school, Mark Poole was there signing cards, and I brought him many, many, many Tempest Mountains.
Sure.
And I brought this, like, it was like 30 or 40 of them that I brought with me. And I remember because his wife was his agent, like, who was the one who, at the time, and I had come up to ask if he would sign this, and she was like, "What do you have?" And I was like, "I have mountains." And she looked at me and she goes, "What?" I said, "I have mountains." And she's like, "Mark, it's not islands, it's mountains," because he signed so many beta islands.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
he sat and talked to me for a while. He was like, "I'm so happy to sign these. I'm so glad," and I still have them. Anything I use, if I play constructor that has those, I use. My Mark Poole signed Tempest Mountains, so I would want him to do that so that the young pyromancer could be standing in front of one of those Tempest Mountains.
That's a fantastic answer. I love that. Well, Mike, this has been a delight, and I thank you so much for showing us through your cube and sharing a lot of your thought behind it. If folks want to follow up some on what you're doing, maybe get a little taste of Ikoria at home, what would be the best place for us to point them?
I would say definitely check out Cube Cobra. It is listed as Ikoria at home, and I my username is Big Tears on Cube Cobra. So, and if it's okay, I have a couple of friends who I would also shout out there.
Yeah, please.
Mad Chalupa, and that's Chilupa, is a friend of mine who does a lot of really cool work with cubes and has them all posted there. I had mentioned to you before we had started that he has a jumpstart project that he's been working on that he has. I'd say it's north of 100 decks that he has designed that he carries around in a big bag, and we do this, and it is a blast. He is definitely this person that I theory craft like a lot. I bounce off ideas for him, and then D Nolan 08 is also someone on Cube Cobra. He actually was at CubeCon with me, and one of his cubes was in the event. That was the goat game objects and tokens peasant cube.
Strong acronym for sure.
Yeah, it was a synergy cube. It is very, very interesting. We talked about like synergy as a buzzword in here, but that is a cube that is literally like the little interactions on it will melt your brain sometimes. But it's a very dense format. But when all the you make your device where it all goes off, right? It is really, really powerful and really fun. But those are two people specifically who design a lot of cubes, spend a lot of time cubing. D Nolan actually won the Steel City Cube event, as it was one of the feeders into CubeCon. So they've got their cube credentials and are worth looking at.
Excellent. I will say, I think I walked by the goat cube at one point on staff, and I saw so many heads and hands trying to trying to figure out what was going on the boards. Uh,
The amount of times I've drafted that cube, and like we drafted it recently, and he put some of the rooms in from Duskmorn,
oh yeah.
and the room, there's a room, I don't know the name off the top of my head, but like anytime a card comes from your graveyard to your hand, you get a 2/2 zombie, or it just like leaves your graveyard, right?
Oh
And I was like,
man.
okay, well, what could that be? It was like, oh, we have flashback, and we have Psychotog, and we have this. I didn't take it, and I ended up drafting this blue black deck with Psychotog, and I spent the entire draft going, I should have taken this card. Like I could not stop thinking about how I had messed up and not taken this one card to unlock all of these different synergies, and that's what drafting that cube was like. So
Well, those are some of the best feelings too when you finish up and go, okay, next time, here's what I want to do. You're just ready to jump right back in.
100%.
Well, Mike, thank you so much again for your time, for your passion. This has been a joy for me. Hope there are more opportunities to connect soon.
Oh no, appreciate that. I mean, seriously, thank you for having me. I appreciate reaching out, and I appreciate you taking the time to go and ask people about their passions and about these things that I think that Cube and the Cube community is something that I find very, very delightful. And I think that Magic discourse has sometimes gotten quite rotten. People have their feelings, and Cube feels like this oasis where people just are very creative and love the cards and love what they make. And it makes me very happy.